Wonderful. All right, we are now recording, so thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Tony Doucette. I'm the Executive Director for APTi. Dario was nice enough to come and do a preview webinar today about his pre-conference workshop and certification workshop happening at the conference that we're holding in Miami in just slightly over 1 month. Dario is doing some of the more exciting work in the field of type right now with the science of neuroscience and personality, and he's going to be telling us a little bit about the topic in general and also what you can expect from the system and from the pre-conference event and the certification workshop. If you have not already registered for the conference or you would like to find out more, I am putting the registration link in the chat box right now. As for the platform that we're using today, we're using a platform called Fuse Meeting, and it is a slightly different setup for PCs versus Macs. If you are using a PC, you will notice on the left-hand side you have your web attendees list, your call attendees list, and your meeting chat. I will be keeping all of the lines muted today except for Dario, unless we possibly get to the end and have time to open it up for some questions, when we may allow everyone's lines to be unmuted and we can have a little bit of a discussion. If you are on a Mac, you will notice those options are along the top of your screen. If you want to use your meeting chat, just simply select that, and you can address questions to the group by addressing them to everyone. Or if you're having any technical issues that you need assistance with, feel free to direct those just to me at APT International and in parentheses host, and I will do my best to assist you with those issues during the webinar. So with that, Dario, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tony, for inviting me. I'm very excited for all of you who have joined this morning. And I understand there are quite a number of folks who are already signed up for the pre-conference workshop. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, as well as the follow-up on Sunday and Monday, right after the conference on the certification and why do that. What does it add to your use of the 16 types and all the sort of course, ancillary tools we already use with type, whether that's temperament, interaction styles, the Jungian functions, archetypes. As you know, there's the suite of things that have a long tradition in type, and it seems that neuroscience is now offering, yes, yet another piece that we can put in our type toolbox. So just talk a little bit about that and some brief introductory stuff, as well as sort of a tour of, as Tony said, the pre-conference and the certification. Okay, so it's, okay, technical issues, there we go. Okay, so what I'm hoping you are going to get is, both from the one day, but more so from the certification, is to get confident with the neuroscience of personality. And I think that happens most often when we find someone from the audience. Say we go into an organization presenting type, and that person wants to know what is the science behind this, and they're not just talking about the statistics. Neuroscience is really an up-and-coming topic today. I find in keeping up with it, there is a new paper published every single day, if not more so. And so what's going on? To be able to have the confidence to point to the resources, to even use the resources, to even design activities that tap neuroscience and fit perfectly with your use of type. That is what I hope for as your goal coming in. And then to leave with that knowledge and the resources, because I do believe, knowing about the neuroscience is one thing, having the resources in hand to use, that's another. Again, the dates are July 10th for the pre-conference workshop, and just before the APTi conference, and then the 14th and 15th are the certification, and that's a Sunday afternoon and a Monday, and we did it that way in order to save folks money. And because the workshop is normally, certification is normally 3 days, there will be a follow-up webinar, sort of basically what you're doing now. And that portion will be primarily around professional development, and we'll talk about what that is. Okay, so the workshop is very much designed in mind with your personal and professional needs, especially when we meet again for the certification, wanting to know What are some of your desired outcomes? So it's more than just about conveying academic knowledge. It really is your ability to go away with some cool stuff. So be able to speak to technical clients, skeptical clients, curious clients. For some folks, say, if I only had 3 slides that you use, if I could wave around your book, okay, that's at one end. And at the other end, to be able to answer some of the questions that people have and introduce really cool stuff. Keep pace with the ongoing science of personality types. So neuroscience is a little bit different than stuff we're used to maybe in the type community, because with type we're used to something being sort of, this is set. This is how we've been doing it for 50 years. The model is known, the types are known, and that's all good. At the neuroscience part, there's new discoveries every day. So when you do the certification, you actually become enrolled in a whole ongoing process. That doesn't mean you get emails every day. We're not going to badger you. But it does mean you have access to things like an online Dropbox with materials, that there's emails that go out that let you all know what's going on. So also an opportunity to offer your clients fresh material. No doubt many of you have heard the question, can you do type, but we need it to be familiar, but we want it to be new. Or we want something completely new, but it has to fit with what we've done before. So how do you do that? Don't you love clients when they're that way? So this is still type, and it's new. Use activities for individuals and teams that build cognitive skills and new habits. So that's something that comes with the certification primarily, although we do a couple of activities even in the pre-conference workshop, and that's the kind of stuff that you actually take home and you can incorporate if you want to into what you do. But I really want to give you the skills to use the neuroscience in a way that adds to your practice. Another feature I feel is important is a lot of times people feel that the brain is about cognition, and they're like, oh, but what about the heart? What about emotions? And that's actually part of the brain too. Cognition, behavior, and emotions are all wrapped up in the brain and work together. So when we pay attention to how other people are responding to us, for example, we may feel embarrassment or self-consciousness. Those are emotions, and they're also perception, and then usually there's some kind of behavior that goes along with it, or thoughts that go with it. So the brain weaves those all together, and I present actually a very simple model of how we can weave in emotions into our discussion of personality, which I think sometimes, a lot of folks add on emotional intelligence or some other model with the use of type, and that's great. It works with emotional intelligence, and at the same time, it allows us to go right in and talk about type and emotions at the same time. So just a little bit about me and my background. About 6 years ago, I started hands-on neuroscience in a lab at UCLA, and this was actually not the lab that I use now, but this was the anthropology library. This was the very first term that I worked with students, the very first time when we were just doing exploration and trying out different experiments and so on. It was fantastic. To read about the neuroscience is one thing. To sit there and see the brain activity as a person is talking, as they're doing a speed date, as they're doing math problems, as they're meditating, that was just fantastic. And so I spent 2 to 3 hours ultimately with the students doing a variety of tasks informed by type. So type tells us that social interaction is just as relevant as doing math problems. And allowing people to work in an open-ended, spontaneous way is just as important as giving them step-by-step tasks to do. So keeping type in mind as a guide as they did various tasks. This is what I would see using the EEG monitor. And this we hear these various colors on the screen. And the one on the right is a bird's eye view, that little sort of bird's eye view of the brain down there, the neocortex. On the left-hand side, you would see this other one with bars. What's important to know is that these would be changing about every 1/4 of a second. And the colors would change, the length of the bars would change, and of course all of this information is recorded as well. So there is a lot of data, 45 million data points from the usual session, and a tremendous amount to interpret. So it was very, very exciting, but it did take a few years to really get a handle on what goes on with the brain is I tested dozens and dozens of students. Right now we have over 6 dozen, and more continues now with folks at midlife. So the sort of the basic principles here is that particular regions of the brain light up when being used for an activity. They may light up a lot or a little bit, and usually that tells us how engaged a person is. Dark regions of the brain indicate what's not in use or an activity that's become automatic. And that actually is a really important insight. So it could mean we're not using an area because it's not of interest to us. That region is maybe not well developed in the brain, or it doesn't have what's called a low threshold, so it's not easily activated. Or it's because it's as simple as signing your name and doesn't evoke a lot of activity. What we've discovered, though, is even though our preferences are usually things that come easy to us, so if you have a sensing preference, sensing usually comes easy, but it turns out the brain is still going to light up in a way that taps sensing because we're motivated. And motivation is just as important as competence when it comes to the brain. So that's why I think type, when it talks about preference, is actually much more important than something like behavior, because that preference really taps into what motivates us as well as what's competent. There's also a variety of holistic patterns. So the brain is more than a toolbox. It's, the metaphor I use is that it's like a symphony. There are a variety of musical instruments. It offers us a couple dozen truly different musical instruments, and it's how we use those together. And how we use them together actually turns out to be the biggest pointer to type. Type influences which sort of tools we like, which instruments we like, but beyond that, it's the songs that the brain plays, those holistic patterns that are really of interest. There's also these circuits and zigzag sequences, and we don't get into those as much, but that's also an emerging part of neuroscience, is how the brain works in these patterns over time. And the key exciting part for us is the favorite regions. That we have those, and each of us individually. And the good news is that those patterns relate to type. And let's take a look, actually, and see what those look like. This is just an overall, by the way, sort of to orient you. And this is not everything the brain does, but it's a little sample of a bird's eye view. And the circle here, the triangle on the top is the nose. And then on the left and the right, those little things sticking out, those are the ears. So inside the brain, what's going on? And there's all these different things the brain does, explaining and deciding, filtering input, noticing errors, allowing novelty, understanding humor. Of course, there's more than one brain area for understanding humor, but there is a region that really helps us. And I want to stress that although the brain is thought of as modular, what it is that each module helps us do something. That of course, there's many ways in the brain to get something done, and there's more than one route to satisfaction, which I think is the lesson we already know from type. Building and rotating images, doing math and reading, recalling beautiful experiences, aesthetics, hearing tone of voice, projecting into the future, hostility, embarrassment, all of these different emotions and aspects of who we are in the brain. And it's funny, though, somebody once asked me if I could do a computer simulation of the brain, and that seems sort of funny, just based on this map, because I said your brain that's not in an environment, not in a social situation or physical environment, that doesn't make any sense. The brain doesn't know what to do if there's no environment. So all these things are about helping us survive with people in society and culture and in our physical environment. Now let's take a look at where type comes in. And this is just, I'm going to compare two folks of fairly different types, and one of these is Ross. And notice I start with the person, not with the type, because every person's a little bit different. Change the names to protect the innocent. Ross is ESTP, preferences. And how to look at the map here is that the white regions are the most active, then the gray are intermediate, and finally the least active are black. And in fact, we can't even see here what the black does. But what we see the white does, those active regions, and I'm not going to explain the terms here, but I think that you get a good sense that when you see something like categorize and define, deductive reasoning, weighing pros and cons, that includes risk and uncertainty, managing a process. So it's an open-ended experience. How do we manage that open-ended experience? There's a few other things as well. Hearing words, acting as a tactical navigator, which is sort of like basketball, or if you're European, that's like football, soccer. what kind of brain does this look like in terms of the favorite tools? If I ask, does this more look like someone who prefers thinking or someone who prefers feeling? What we see here is a lot of stuff that would support the thinking preference. So as someone with a thinking preference, like an ESTP, is going to be using those regions of the brain, like deductive reasoning, categorizing and defining, and so on, because that fits their need. Similarly, if I asked about sensing and intuiting, I think that the preference here is actually betrayed by what's missing, that we don't see things related to imagination or asking what if, or brainstorming. So the thought is maybe this has a sensing preference, and then that in fact is the case. So essentially the brain is a toolbox, and we are using the tools that support our type. Let's take a look at a very different type, which you may be this type or this one or a different one. But as I toggle quickly between them, you can see the pictures are quite different. They're almost opposites. And this is Mary, who identifies with INFP. And the regions that are active for her in white include hearing words on the left, also imagining and asking what if, personal beliefs, or literal recall, one of the two. That depends if Mary is INFP or ISTJ. So we're going to talk about type development, of course, during the workshop. And type development, we actually do move towards our opposite type. And many times adjacent brain regions are actually home to the things that are our opposites. Hearing voice, tone, and intentions, thinking about symbols in the future, visual themes and impressions. And now if I were to ask, does this person sound more like feeling or thinking preference, listening to others, attending to tone of voice, attending to intentions and personal beliefs, that certainly sounds more like feeling than thinking. And then intuiting, Mary is using the brain regions that support her intuiting preference, imagining and asking what if, the symbols in the future. And something that may pop out, by the way, is Mary's preference for explaining and deciding. And I think normally when we think of decision makers, we think of someone who makes 10 decisions before breakfast. Okay, those EJ types out there, maybe ESTJ. But INFPs make decisions too. They make a lot of decisions all the time. They're quiet decisions. They're decisions like, what am I about to say? Does that fit my personal beliefs? This action that I'm going to take, does that fit who I am, or how does that impact others? They may also spend 5 years on a very important personal decision about whether to change jobs or to change some aspect of their lives and their identity, such as whether or not to be a vegetarian. I know one a dominant feeling type, who spent 5 years deciding that question. So really, actually, the brain activity does more than fit with type. It actually reminds us about certain key aspects of type. Like INFPs seem very relaxed and laid back, and going on in their heads, they are deciding things. So that gives a little bit of the sense of how we notice what's going on with the brain and the resources it provides and how that fits with type. And statistically, of course, we have some great statistics there. But before I show you that, I want to show you an application here. And this idea of overlap. So we have two people with very different brains coming together. How is it that they get along, and where are their differences? So if you've used MBTI or any aspect of type, you are aware that where people have overlaps is often where they get along, and where people have differences, that is often where they, experience differences, challenges. The same is true for the toolbox in our brain. So Mary and Ross actually look quite different, and with different types, it's not a surprise then that they're going to have some challenges communicating with each other. Fortunately, our culture provides us with a few commonalities, like paying attention to word content. It's something we're all raised to do for 12 years in school and probably in college. And that's something that they pretty much share as well, whether it's white or light gray. And some other regions along the way as well, in terms of paying attention to visual stuff and making decisions, that's there. But there's also a few key differences. So when Mary starts talking about personal beliefs, that's a region of the brain that Ross generally doesn't activate. So he's going to go somewhere else in his brain to respond. So that's sort of one of the principles that we see in the brain that overlaps with the principles we've already learned from type. Now, what about those statistics I promised? If we took two people of the same type, two INFPs, in fact, let's take 10 INFPs, and line them up and look at their brain activity, And in fact, I have looked at a bunch of INFPs. What's the chance that they're going to have nearly identical brain maps like we just saw? The chance is actually quite slim. It's that little blue pie slice there. So you know what? Having the same type doesn't mean you're identical. And we already know that as type users. What we know rather is that type tends to point to not only preferences, but that we share a lot of things in common. Not everything, but a lot of things. And that's what we see as that big red, I wouldn't even call that a slice, that's really half the pie. And that is, when I say most of the brain activity, I mean 85%. And that means two people of the same type, wow, sharing 85% of their brain activity in common. That's quite impressive. There's also the big slice there that's green, half the activity. So that's like 50% of their brain activity in common. So there are folks who are INFPs who don't look quite like Maria, but you know what? They don't look like Ross either. They don't look like some opposite type, but they have some meaningful differences. And oftentimes those differences, as we get to know people, we learn that those have to do with their hobbies. And even as I looked at college students, many of them have been doing hobbies for 5, 10, even 15 years. And those were reflected in the brain, whether it was doing martial arts or dance, whether it was involvement in the language arts. So there are natural differences. Painting, drawing, those things come to light and they show in the brain. And we would hope that people of the same type do, in fact, show some differences. Finally, there's that little purple sliver and somewhat similar activity. So that's sort of like a third in common. And that was actually the minimum for people of the same type. Very different from people of very different types, opposite types, those folks that have a chance of having nothing in common either. 1 in 5 people of different types have nothing in common in terms of their brain map. So this is, I have more technical views than this, but I think colorful pie slices are something that communicate well with people. These kind of statistics, I think, really act to support and, you know, add a few things to this, like saying the number of people in the study and where it was done and so on, and you have a great slide to show your skeptical clients, curious clients wanting to know, does type matter in the brain? Because we know it matters in practice, but where does it show up in the brain? And the answer is yes, it does. Okay, so it's sort of a summary, and as a segue into some of the applications. Various regions do similar tasks for all of us. Okay, that's something I found. We have this toolbox. In fact, it's not just me, how I label the brain and what I look at, the kind of EEG I use. It's all stuff that neuroscientists use out there. Every brain region I talk about, there's a published research study in a peer-reviewed neuroscience journal that talks about that, or at the very least, a neuroscience textbook. Sometimes people ask me, like, well, how do we know that part of the brain is for listening? And I'm like, that's not even a published study for that. I mean, we'd have to go back decades. You just open a neuroscience textbook, you'll find it there. So we know we have these regions and they do similar tasks. Even if you're left-handed, it just means the regions are in a different place. You still have the same toolbox. But people vary greatly in how much stimulus is needed to activate a region. So there's a region on the left side of your skull, if you're right-handed, that is behind your ear, and that part assists us with noticing and responding to social feedback. Okay, everybody has that region. But if you're an ENFJ, for example, well, you're going to find that pretty much any stimulus in your environment coming from other people is going to get that region active. It's going to have higher activity. And you're going to do something with that stimulus. You're not only just going to notice that people are looking at you, giving you a funny face, giving you a happy face, saying something that is positive, supportive, critical, whatever it is, you're going to respond to that. Your brain's going to get active around it. You have infrastructure there. On the other hand, if you're a very different type, say INTP, you have that same tool there, but that's something you rarely pull it out, and a lot of stimulus is needed in order to get it active. And there are some really interesting teaching applications and learning applications that come because of that, knowing how much stimulus is needed and what happens when we get too much. Also, people of the same type tend to use similar brain regions, but not necessarily. There are individual differences. That's why being able to assess cognitive skills is important. That's why I say the certification is important on day 2, because we talk about how do you assess and work with cognitive skills, which is essentially the story of how do we work with differences between individuals. Type is a tremendous guide, and it's the beginning. Even if you do step 2 with folks, step 2 is still about preferences and behavior. to some extent, but it's not about the cognitive skills that are there. So what are those skills? And that really allows you then, you can go in with type, you have a strong sense of what's of value to the person, what they prefer, and then you want to be able to know what are those skills that are really useful for things like career counseling. Also, team assessment, where are the skills lying on the team, where may the team have weak spots. There are unique global patterns, and those correlate with the 8 Jungian functions the most. So going back to Carl Jung 90 years ago, actually, what is it, even less than that now. 16 types as well. So I don't have all the maximum data I'd like to have for all 16 types. So some of what I say about individual types like ISTP is tentative, but still I have a lot of people. And for neuroscience, by the way, it is very acceptable to publish even in a top journal if you have 12 people in your study, much less if you have 64 people. Young adults have 2 or 3 functions that are very active, 2 or 3 of those global patterns. And I'm now looking at people in midlife and discovering that they more have 3 to 5, and that those extra ones are usually associated with their opposite type. Surprise, surprise. It's not a surprise to us. Really exciting to see. I had an INFJ musician who's also a professor and actually type qualified as well, and type certified. And looking at the brain activity, I said there is just as much INFJ there as there is ISTP. And it's almost your opposite type, but it is there. And, that's what happens at midlife, apparently, is we tap in truly, our brain does, to patterns that support our opposite type. So one of the results that came out of it is clarification of the 8 Jungian functions. And I know that a lot of times folks don't go to the level of these 8 functions or function attitudes, or cognitive processes, the different terms, but all mean the same thing. Because there's a little bit of conflict and lack of clarity. How can we explain these well to people so that they understand them? And the brain activity actually supports most of the 8 functions. At least that's where I am now. And so how can we describe those? And I'm going to go into one in detail, extroverted sensing, in a moment. But I just wanted to let you know that, yes, that we're looking at the level of the 8 functions. So that it's really exciting to see actually that it's the dominant function that makes a difference. And that when we look at something like extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling, what are the differences between them? Because on the surface, they can show a lot of same things. If you have a manager who's ENFJ and another one who's ENTJ, many things they'll do in common. They're going to come with a vision and imagination for where the project or the team or the organization is going. They do organizing. They have an in-charge style to them. But what's going on? The ENTJ is using brain regions that promote evidence-based decision-making. So what are the words that are heard? What data do they recall? What is it that they see in front of them? And then using that in a very efficient way. In fact, extroverted thinking types use their brain in an efficient way. They're not only just efficient about their environment and wanting efficiency and wanting evidence. That's how their brain works. In contrast, that ENFJ is using brain regions that promote social and interpersonal cohesion. So drawing upon regions that are attending to the social feedback, that are tapping into the reading of faces and recognizing the meaning of faces, that tap into personal belief. And then using that in the executive regions of the brain to share information, explain decisions, organize people based upon what people like, what they need, what they value, and just in general using their brain in a fairly different way. Even though they can have some behaviors on the surface which they share in common, similar style. So we could go through and talk about all of those, which of course is the part of the workshop, and specifically day 1. So if you come to the pre-conference workshop, we're going to go over the 8 functions and the coaching tips that come with those. Before we look at one specific example, I have a question here. Since stimulus activates our less used regions, is that part of the explanation or appearance for shadow under stress? Absolutely, I believe that's the case. I have seen this in the lab. For example, INTP, normally the social feedback region on the left side of the brain doesn't get too active very often. But if you pass that threshold to get it to active, it will come in not as a whisper, but as a tsunami. So it will go from nothing to everything, and not only will that region light up, but all the regions around it will light up, as if the brain is being washed over, overwhelmed. And in fact, it's in a way what happens, because when we use a region of the brain consistently over the years, we essentially build infrastructure there. New neural circuits are burned, pathways are burned. It's sort of like there are channels. So when the flood of water comes in, the water has somewhere to go because there are channels burnt there. But for that INTP, that less used region, something from day to day, year to year, used less often, there's less infrastructure, the water comes in, and it's like water rushing over a flat floodplain. There's no channels to catch it, and so it just overwhelms the brain. And so what happens under stress, we literally get overwhelmed. And what's next to that stress region is social feedback. Well, parts that have to do with speaking, remembering information, having a precise body language, and physical movement. So not a surprise when somebody gets really embarrassed. What happens? Well, they forget what they were going to say. They mix their words. They get klutzy. And it might not just be immediate. It might be even a half a minute or a minute later. The brain gets overwhelmed. And so there really is actively, that's something we talk about in the workshop, specifically on day 2. Is what happens when stimulus overwhelms the less used regions of our brain. And that says a lot about type and really brings in the stuff about when we're overwhelmed by the shadow and those terms that we've been using in type. What do those mean in the neuroscience? So we get into that. We also have a second question here. Do I suspect that parsing the brain map into more regions, assuming there were no limits to the volume of data, would show more or less similarity of active regions amongst each type? I do think so, because even though I have the brain sort of divided into 20 regions there's a really big map that we use that really looks into all of the neuroscience. And that map is 60 regions, essentially. And folks do, and we'll actually look at this in a moment, have an opportunity to look in detail at those 60 regions. It's not quite the same as doing EEG, but I do find it's very helpful for folks. And they love it because it involves crayons. And that we do see individual differences amongst types. So say like ESFP versus ENFP. One of the differences we see is that ESFPs can get irritated a lot more easily than their ENFP counterparts. And irritation is just sort of a little submodule or subset, but it's important to know about. By the way, those ESFPs do not report their irritation many times. They do what my stepmother does, which she says she holds her tongue. But having had, fortunately, quite a number of ESFPs go through and looking at the brain map in detail, knowing that that actually is something important to them. Okay, so let's actually take a look at one function, and I even go into more detail than what I'm going to show here. I tell stories and so on. As we get into the 8 functions, give tips, but I can at least show you what are some of the highlights that I've learned from the brain activity and what are the insights that follow from it, those essential tips. So on the first day, which is the pre-conference, we step through the 8 functions after we do some brain basics. And the first one we talk about is extroverted sensing. So even if you're not really familiar with the 8 functions, that's fine, because on the left-hand side there you can see on that green strip, I show the different ways that extroverted sensing is represented within the type community. So we have SE, so that's sensing, that's with an extroverted attitude, or the SP types, sensing perceiving types. Also, in terms of which type specifically does this apply to, we're talking about ESTP and ESFP primarily, but also their introverted siblings, ISTP and ISFP secondarily. So those are the folks, the SP types that we're talking about here. To a lesser extent, folks who have these as opposite types too, but that's really at midlife and beyond. I love cartoons and I love visuals, and every one of these begins with the question, what is enlightenment? And a very Jungian theme, isn't it? So these pilgrims have climbed up the side of the mountain and come into the cave, and they're asking the guru, what is enlightenment? And in this case, he's giving them the extroverted sensing answer, which is, what color are the flowers at the entrance? So that actually belies a number of things. One is, while you were on your way here, Were you just thinking about the goal, or were you attending to the joy of the journey along the way? Also, maybe it's a suggestion to go out and pay attention to the flowers at the entrance. What is there? And in the act of doing so, one will find in that moment of heightened sensory acuity, of smelling the flowers, of looking at them, some insights into the world at large. That nature represents in many ways both the beauty and the terribleness of the universe, human beings, and the human condition, as well as also the joy of, probably not wanting to eat that disgusting smelling flower, or that there'll be bugs out there, and we have that ooh response that comes, and kids love that. So it takes us back to our childhood experiences in many cases, as well as appreciating the here and now in every moment of our adult lives. I'm going to mention two things that have come up in the brain research. One of these is called the tennis hop. So this is a particular pattern of brain activity, and this is not a scientific term, the tennis hop, but I think it represents it well. If you've watched tennis players, you'll see that they don't just stand there on the court. Even when it's not their turn, when the ball is off and away on the other side of the court, what are they doing? They're bouncing a little bit back and forth. Not a big bounce, a little bounce. Why do they hop? Tennis players hop to maintain momentum. And it's not like it's a big energy expenditure. It's a little energy expenditure. And it's readying them at any moment to go left, to go right, to go forward, to go back, whatever is needed to respond to the moment of what's coming up. We see this with everybody. Almost everyone in the lab shows this tennis hop pattern when I sit them with this video game where they're driving a little car. It's called Mario Kart. And they're driving this race car, and they're going through an urban environment, and a baby carriage comes, or a bridge rises, or there's a T in the road. And if you're speeding along at 80 miles an hour and there's a T in the road, that's sort of a problem. So folks maintain this kind of brain pattern when they're doing things that essentially are requiring spontaneous responses to the environment where the outcome is critical. Crisis-type situations. And it's not a surprise then that ESFP and ESTP types rely on this low energy, and it is low energy. It doesn't demand a lot of the brain. It's a tennis hop, and they are in this mode, this game-like mode, as their default. When they're just sitting there in the lab, when they're doing some activity. I've seen this with an ISFP as well. I gave him some stuff to do. I said, maybe his brain will get more active. It was active for a few seconds, and then it went back to the tennis hop. And it affords this rapid response to crises, that the brain is a little bit active, but it's not wearing itself out. It's just waiting for whatever comes. Another pattern I've shown that I've seen is this solid blue, this bright blue. And what this indicates in the brain for anybody is that the person is, first of all, that all the regions of the brain are in sync, that they are absolutely same frequency, same amplitude, same, in other words, brain activity, all regions going together, flowing together. And this particular bright blue means that the person is awake and alert, but also relaxed, very relaxed. And people can show this for a few seconds or for a few minutes. In fact, up to 10 minutes when they're doing a task as an expert, particularly a creative task. So the first time I saw this was just an INFP sitting there and listening to me. And at first I thought, this is a listening mode, everybody shows this. But it turns out, no, actually INFPs and some of their cousins like ISFPs and ENFPs and ESFPs, in other words, the FP folks, they show this solid blue pattern. And then I had somebody with extroverted sensing preference, an ESFP, and what did he show? Well, he showed the solid blue, but very different times when handling a crisis. So they get up and they do a role play. I had theater students come in and engage them in role play. And it turns to a solid blue as he's engaged in the role play. And it's no surprise, he says afterwards, he says the more of a crisis something is, and he used that word crisis, the more of a crisis something is, the more I get into it. And he wasn't the only ESFP. I had 3 ESFPs that same term, and all 3 of them showed this pattern during the role play. I had an ISFP. I asked him to, and later on other ISFPs, to arrange some random objects in an artistic way that's emotionally compelling. And while composing the objects, while composing this compelling piece, set piece, they went to the solid blue. This composing of something beautiful. So if you've heard SPs called artisans, I think that's where the term comes from. and or playing a ball toss game with agility. Not just one ball going back and forth, but 2 balls, 3 balls. Back and forth, back and forth. Nobody else really shows this pattern, whether they're doing it skillfully or fumbling it, but these SP folks, they get in the flow when doing something physical that involves multitasking, and that really is a whole body activity. Requires a lot of attention, interacting with another person, coordinating with that person to get that ball and make sure it comes back to them. Essentially, the lesson is, and we talk about this on day 1, and people of other types show this pattern, but when doing what comes naturally to their type. And people also show this when they're doing what comes expert to them. So in ENFP, not all ENFPs are ballet dancers, but when we do have a ballet dancer ENFP come in, she showed this when just relaxing, recalling what it's like to do ballet even. So really this is a signpost to this idea of flow, and it's often about creative flow. And really, really wonderful to see this in the brain and to know that type is a great pointer to what probably is going to take this person to a state of flow. So what are some tips then that come out of this observation and many others? I could actually go on with 5 more observations about the SP folks in the brain, and we do that on the pre-conference day, as well as a little bit in the certification too. They prefer stimulating environments with rich sensory input, work in a place with windows. I saw ISFP and ESFP, every time they get up, they look out the window of the lab, so it's a beautiful park outside the lab. Their brain just lights up and gets active. They go back to their tasks, they get bored. The brain gets bored. They may be working, but the brain is bored. Enticing views, interesting decor. I think this almost fits with what we know about extroverted sensing, and it's good to be reminded it does matter. It's not arbitrary. We're not guessing. This really does matter to their brains. Provide and encourage movement. Had an ESFP once, he said, "Can I stand up? Standing helps me think." And in fact, when he stood up, his brain got more active. Considering ways to take breaks while remaining productive, such as taking talking while walking to a park. Okay, so this is, if you know you're going to be with a client for 2 hours and they're an ESTP, don't sit with them in a closed room. I mean, they're adults, they'll do it, but you're going to get more out of them if you say halfway through, let's say, hey, let's take a walk and get some coffee and come back. And during that time, actually, they're going to be engaged with you, and they're going to be more active in terms of the brain. Make ideas meaningful, I found, with relevant context. SPs have wonderful memories as long as that information is presented in a context, a dramatic context, a story. Sensory details, physical tools, so that the ball toss actually translates into something meaningful. Allow them to test the tools by trial and error. I saw this as well. That's part of what the tennis hop does too. Don't rely on metaphor. I didn't say don't use it. I said don't rely upon it. And in fact, rely on the familiar meanings of metaphors. So a common metaphor might be, let's say an uncommon metaphor. She married a rock. What does that mean? Well, most people think she married someone stoic and strong and quiet. She married an ISTP, perhaps. That is a familiar interpretation. They'll gravitate to that. Married a literal rock, we fancy that in our mind. Oh, there's a person walking down the aisle and there's a little rock there walking along. No, that is definitely more intuiting territory. Focus on challenges and allow for resourceful responses to crises. And holding back over defining the experience, making it too safe, that those can be difficulties for them, that you're not going to get them into flow that way. We saw that when you allow for an open-ended response, in other words, managing a process, use that part of the brain that's about managing processes. Allow them to do role-play type of stuff in a training session, or being more open-ended in terms of the day-to-day work, that you're going to let them get into that state of flow where they're the most productive and creative. Let them respond to whatever comes up and be willing to join them if you wish to earn friendship and respect. And then sort of like, you take that as the tennis hop. Imagine you go onto a tennis court and you got your racket ready and you're dressed up for the day and you got your ball there and there's nobody on the other side, no one to play with. Or worse yet, you've got somebody on the other side and that person doesn't know how to play tennis and you're just itching to have one of those days where you're like, I just want to play. This is not a teaching day to teach somebody else tennis. I just want to play. It can be frustrating when that other person can't return the ball. And that's oftentimes how SP folks feel. It's like they say, we want to play with somebody who can play with us. And you know, if I'm coming with the tennis racket and the ball, I want the other person to come with those too, and to work with me, to come into that state of flow with me, with the activity. So these are all tips that I think make sense for folks who, if you've been working with SP types, especially ESTP and ESFP, it's a lot more than taking in information through the five senses. That happens, that's true. And there's so much more in the brain that points us to the specific tips that we can sort of step through. And this is not even all of them, but to step through and sort of say, if we want to work better with these folks, or we want these folks to help them be happier in their environment, get more satisfaction, what is it that we need to know about their brains? And this is the kind of stuff that, despite some individual differences between particular SP types, that these are things that hold true across extroverted sensing. So somebody takes the MBTI, you do that validation process, you've worked with them for a while, you know they have ESTP preferences or whatnot, you can count that this stuff is going to be useful for them. This is going to appeal to their brain. Now, of course, you may be wondering about the other types. And there is a whole 4-page fold-out that I have available. You all, when you come on the first day, will have one that you can use. And if you do certification, you gain access to these. And access, by the way, means more than just ability to purchase. It actually means that you get an online folder through Dropbox. So this is sort of the cloud. You may have heard about the cloud. It's just a place where you can go to online to download these for free. So if you want to print up a bunch of these for clients you have tomorrow, you can go ahead and do that. I'm happy to let you do that. And it's not even an expense. It's just part of getting certification. You get your certification. You get access to these kinds of tools. You can use them as you like. And in this case here, this page, it's not even all of it. This is just the interior, and it sort of touches on the 8 functions. It gives tips for the 8 functions. It brings in a little bit of the brain research, and also it has some secret codes there that allow you to know which type codes relate to what. So that means that you can use these brain materials with or without type codes. I know sometimes people like to begin without type codes and introduce type later. Other folks want to introduce type first in the code, and then they get into details. Regardless of how you do your work, these kinds of handouts can work for you. I'm also pretty happy, by the way, sometimes like this one I actually made for somebody. She called me up. She says, I have to work with 15 teachers tomorrow. They already know type. They've already sorted for type. They just want tools to help them work with their students. Can you create something for me? And I said, absolutely. Coincidentally, once in a blue moon, Dario has free time. And I said, you know what? I happen to have free time this afternoon. I'm going to make a new handout for you. And that's exactly what I did. Popped it into the folder, and there it was right for her. Because what is new knowledge without having the resources to use it? Now, this is another one, and I just want to, I mentioned this at the beginning about motivation and competence, and tie this into this classic exercise that reveals some deep principles. So in learning type, you may have learned this, tried this exercise where you ask folks to sign their name. And you don't even need to say sign your name with your preferred hand, because that's what people do automatically. And that's one of the lessons of type, is that we don't even think about the fact that we're using our preferences. We just go ahead and use them. And we sign our name, and then we go back and say, could you sign your name again using your other hand, which then we reveal this idea of non-preference. And we would expect in the brain activity, and I certainly had this hypothesis, that signing your name should not use your brain. It really shouldn't. I even tease the folks when I go to the UK, even if you're signing your name on a card to the Queen of England, it's probably not going to require brain activity. You've done it so many hundreds or even thousands of times in your life. On the other hand, signing your name with your non-preferred hand should probably use your brain. We're going to see brain activity. And that was my hypothesis. And it so happened that the first group of students I worked with all had intuiting preference, and this was true for them. But as I got to exploring more students of different type preferences, sensing preference, I found this was not the case. Some students using their non-preferred hand did not evoke more brain activity. And this was all sort of revealed by a couple of students who explained why afterward, what was going on. So I had an ESTP, sensing, thinking, perceiving type. He signed his name with his non-preferred hand. Nothing special happened in the brain. And he explained why. He said, this is just like some random weird activity. Like, when would I ever do this in real life? So it wasn't just about competence, it was about motivation. He's like, I can't see the motivation for doing this. Then I had an ENFJ. ENFJ, I still know him. He knows he's an ENFJ. See him every year as he's gone into pharmacy school and does music festivals and so on. And he even points to a part of his brain right now. And he says, I know as an ENFJ, he's like, I'm using this part of my brain. I was in the lab. This is lighting up right now. He points to his brain. He signed with his non-preferred hand in English, no problem. And then he happens to be from Lebanon originally. He signed his name in Arabic, and then signed it again using his left hand in Arabic, and no brain activity. And I thought, oh, wait, he's intuiting preference. It should show up as more brain activity. And he's like, well, no. He's like, in signing my name in Arabic, like, Professor, I know you can't read Arabic, so it doesn't matter. There's no consequence. So again, motivation is a very important part of the piece. So that's why I go back, and I love that word preference because it really is what type is about and personality is about. It's a mixture of competence and motivation, and when they're both there, that's often what preference means, but not always. Sometimes we're motivated to do something we don't have the preference, and that shows up as more brain activity. Sometimes we're great at something. I'm pretty good at math. I took 6 semesters in college of calculus. Okay, my brain can do math. But do I like to do math? Could you pay me to do math? Probably not. So that will definitely require more brain activity because I'm just not. Either I'm going to push myself to do it because I know I have to, and that pushing process evokes brain activity, or I'm just not motivated, so nothing's going to light up. And that's why, even as we know about the brain, we still want to know type models. Okay, we still want type in mind. I know some folks, some colleagues, and they're like, well, now that you've done these neuroscience research, you can discard this type stuff, right? I'm like, no, because the psyche is more than the brain. The personality, psychology, the psyche is our thoughts, our feelings. It is not just brain, it is mind, it is culture, it is our relationships. We need to hear from people, to talk with them. So it's very relevant. So neuroscience complements what we do. And I believe that all the way throughout, that it's a great complement to type. And then, by the way, a practical application of that information is called E equals MC, not squared. Okay, equals MC. Engagement, being engaged means competent and or motivated. And that we have this nice little curve here, and I talk about the curve. I'm not going to give it great detail here, but the idea is engaging activities evoke more brain activity as the challenge and motivation increase. And there are ways that we can structure activities when we're doing skills assessment, or how we can structure activities when we are trying to just get people involved in a workshop activity that are progressive in nature, that move from easier to harder, that move from more or from less motivating to more motivating. And we can see then, we can know that that's involving the brain in a certain way. And that unfamiliar and unimportant activities don't evoke, those tasks do not evoke the brain. And that's important to know too, and to look for the signs, because there are physical signs, not just signs in the brain and my brain equipment. There are physical signs to know when the brain activity drops off. And oftentimes it drops off very quickly. And a person can go from very engaged to completely disengaged in just a few seconds or a couple of minutes. And what are the signs to know when that's happening to go along with the brain activity? Things like eye movement and posture. Another thing that we do, and this is primarily on day 2, so if you come back on Sunday, this is essentially what we'll be doing, is looking at cognitive skill sets. And I do have the permission of these folks. They've gone through the certification program. You may recognize some of them from the type community. They have been, I think we have a past, or is it incoming? No, I think this is the past president of APTi is here. And they've gone through this process, and one of the activities we do is color in these big brain maps. And it doesn't take that long, and it's actually really cool because you go home with a colorful picture of what your likely cognitive skills are. And what is that? What goes into that process? Why are we doing that? So one thing that folks can do, by the way, if you get certified, you get free access to this online exploration tool. It's called the NeuroPQ. This is not anything about type. In fact, knowing the person's type beforehand from MBTI or whatnot is you want to do that before they do the NeuroPQ. And it helps map that individual uniqueness over a variety of brain regions. And it gives you a nice colorful PDF afterward and a report that you can show with your clients. And we discuss how to debrief the report, given some things like what is their background, what is their type code, what is their age, and why particular regions of the brain they indicated were high or low. Now, of course, this is not coming from strapping on a brain mapping cap to them for 3 hours. Instead, they take about half an hour to do this, and whether it's online or it's on the poster. And the how people respond, I've been comparing that, validating that against the actual EEG stuff. So, I've had many, I think like 20 INFPs go in and do this brain map. I don't know how many exactly, if it's 21 or 18, somewhere around there. And comparing that against the 7 INFPs who went through the full-on brain scanning stuff and seeing, are these the same? And statistically as a group, they are pretty close. So that that this is more than just random self-reflection, that there's actually some validation behind this in terms of cognitive skills. So this is a great complement to when you know the person's type. It's a great complement to step 2. To get at, if you look at something like gregarious, an introvert scores as gregarious on step 2. What's going on in the brain to support that skill? And in this case here, this does not look like this is going to be a gregarious person, but it might be because we see this adaptable enthusiast and group facilitator in orange, and orange indicates something that is not maybe the most liked region, but is something that's fairly active for the person in terms of motivation and skill. So this is this kind of online report as well as the posters, and there's also a mini poster. So if you don't want to have people go into all 60 regions of the brain, you can just give them a quick, here are the 20 regions, and this is about 18 inches by 12 inches. No, it's not that. It's 18 by 24, I think that is. Just enough to sit on the person's desk in front of them in a workshop. And there's nice little instructions at the top, and they go through and they read and they color. And then the beautiful thing is they can compare with their teammates. And notice, by the way, it's more than just words. I really felt that there is not just the coloring, but pictures and so on to create a multimedia experience for people. And folks absolutely love and will remember what you give them when they're doing a physical activity. I've seen hundreds of adults do this now, and they love it. It's a wonderful break from content and sitting there to get out those crayons and chat with each other and color things in. And it also is a great way for them to take it home and remember the results, to hang it up in their office or on their refrigerator, and to make neuroscience something relevant in their everyday lives. Because folks remember stories and they remember activities more than they remember pure content. And so I create these kinds of activities as well as the fold-outs because I know that these resources are ways for us to really engage people and help them remember and use the neuroscience. In other words, our use of type helps make it sustainable. And then there's some other supporting stuff, activities that leverage the brain resources. So, for example, once folks fill out this brain map, something that they can do is get together as a team, and they fill out a little team cognitive skill sets sheet. And so for each region of the brain, for each person, they're going to record what their results were, and they're going to compare that against what may be required for their task, and also notice where are their team's blind spots. So it's very much like when you do a type atlas and you're looking for what types are represented, or maybe there are some particular preferences. Say it's a room full of the folks with SJ preference and a few other types, but they notice they have no NP types on the team. So what does that mean in terms of what might be missing? It's the same idea, what cognitive skills might be missing, and therefore how are we going to fill that in? And if you do that along with the type preferences at the same time, then you really do cover all the bases. Because it's not just about preference, because then we're actually getting into what are their cognitive skills and making sure those are represented too. Don't assume that every INFP who comes in is a natural storyteller. And so if storytelling is part of the repertoire that's needed for a marketing campaign or whatnot, how do you include those skills in the team in terms of filling it out, whatever it is. And then actually what I do and what we all will do in the certification program is we actually go through a team problem-solving process. And it's a carefully structured one that's designed to teach some cognitive skills at the same time. And then we come back and evaluate as a team, how did we do and which regions of the brain did we probably really use. There are also other activities, that blue one in the background there, that brains heavy worksheet, steps people through a process that's very much like the zigzag model that you may have learned with the sensing, intuiting, thinking, feeling. You step through those 4 steps there when you're problem solving. This is the same thing, it's just the 8 functions, and the questions are based upon the brain research. And so very, familiar stuff that you've done before, but also different at the same time, because it's bringing in, it isn't 4 zigzag, it's 8 zigzag. And in this case, it's not just team and their preferences type-wise, but it's also team and their cognitive skills. Knowing the type is important, and this adds an extra layer. Some other things I want to talk about as a different application is in leadership. I was just in Brisbane, Australia, about a week and a half ago, and for the Australian Institute of Management, and lots and lots. We had 45 or more folks there who were learning management, leadership skills, brushing up on those, and wanting to know what's going on in the brain. And something astonishing to think about is your brain has more than one CEO. It has 2 CEOs. And those 2 CEOs, and in fact, if you think about it, a lot of companies, especially the sort of popular ones we've known about in the last few years, have had 2 founders. So Google has 2 founders, and they've actually switched off as CEOs. Apple Computer, although we often think of Steve Jobs, there's also Steve Wozniak, his partner in crime. And they were 2 CEOs that now work in very different ways, but they are still within the, well, poor Steve, of course, is known in name only. But this idea that we have 2 CEOs and they do different functions, we see this time and again, and your brain works this way too. And these poor CEOs have to manage the whole brain. So here on the right, we see this gray cutout, the side view of the brain with the brain stem, your spine coming up there, the cerebellum, that's to make sure you breathe and you don't fall over when you walk. The limbic system, and we talked about the limbic system, especially on day 3, what's going on with the limbic system, that which I call the cat-dog brain, because essentially any behavior you see coming from your cat or your dog, you go away for the weekend and you leave your pet at home, what's going to happen when you come back? Well, your pet is probably going to be, 1, overjoyed to see you because of those bonds of affiliation and the natural love and affection that a dog or a cat can give. But at the same time, they may also be angry that you left them for the weekend. So another set of conflicting emotions about loneliness, of fear, of being uncertain of what's going on. Occasionally, pets also wreak revenge, don't they? So all of those emotions come out of the limbic system and those conflicting patterns there. And the neocortex, those executive regions, have to manage those, as well as that whole bird's eye view map of cognitive skills that we have. And to learn about those executive regions and how they translate into leadership styles that correspond very well with the attitudes, the type attitudes and the type codes. In other words, EP, EJ, IP, and IJ. Those 4 combinations actually show up very clearly in the brain and translate into how our executives work, how our executive regions work. There are also emotional centers, and this is something to talk about on day 3. Is how each of these cognitive regions ties into and uses emotions in some way. And I'm one of those folks who believe that the brain evolved in order to help us survive. And that means, that's where my belief comes in, that means that when the brain is urging us to do something by sending emotions or thoughts or whatever it is, that it's attempting to help us survive and prosper. Now, it might be that what evolved or our childhood patterns or whatnot, that those are no longer useful in the present, but they did evolve, they did come about because they meant to help us survive. So what are the signals that it sends? Why are they sending them? And what do they do about them when we get them? So something to know actually in this box section here on the upper left, it says FP1, that's the prefrontal region on the left-hand side of your brain. And the FP1, by the way, is how neuroscientists label that region. It's a big one. It's very important. Please don't ever suffer brain damage there. That will not serve you well. One of the things it does is it filters out negative or distracting information. So if somebody criticizes you, that region of the brain wants to filter out that information to say, I didn't hear that. I'm just going to continue on happily doing what I'm doing. One of the results of that, and by the way, it does many other things too, but one of the results of that is that there's lower self-awareness. And we actually know this from neuroscience studies that have been set up that allow people to either increase their self-awareness by engaging in one particular kind of activity or just be more productive and goal-fulfilling to distract, to filter out distractions, and therefore to get less self-awareness. So there's actually, it's not just me who's saying this, there's published research studies out there, very smartly designed, and show that this region promotes and is associated with feelings of confidence and happiness, along with filtering out negative information. We already have a word for this. It's called ignorance is bliss. It's a phrase. And it's not a surprise then for people who have a lot of activity here. And who are the folks who have the most activity? ESFJ and ENFJ are the two types. Those dominant extroverted feeling types have the most activity here. And they're the folks who are very good at remaining optimistic against all odds. Now, that doesn't mean that they have lower self-awareness long-term, because they have that other CEO, which assists them in self-awareness. So they go there in their own time, in their quiet time. But when they're out in the world engaging with other people, they maintain that confidence, that happy demeanor, the chipperness, the optimism, and they're not going to go to those places that are going to be dark and self-reflective and so on when they're with other people, unless it's those very special trusted relationships. That also means that if they spend a lot of time there, that they're going to avoid the things that are unhappy, that are perhaps pointing to some stuff that is what we sometimes call the ugly truth. And how do we get there? How do we move them from that space to the other CEO? Because both of us use both sides of our brain. That's not a problem. We can get them there. The question is how. What's the safe way to do that? And as we tour around the brain, and I've only even mentioned a few here, a few of emotions associated. Sadness, empathy, humor, liking and disliking, hostility, worry, relief, independence, the feeling of oneness or unity with others, fear, paranoia, curiosity, shame, embarrassment, sexual impulse, feelings of romance. We might think emotions, those are all supposed to be deep in the brain, the animal brain, but that's not true. They're in, well, they are down there too, but they're also in our higher brain functions. That when we receive social feedback from other people, in this region down in the lower left-hand corner, that T5 region, it helps us notice feedback from others, and it also, conveniently or not, promotes feelings of shame, curiosity, and embarrassment. And those emotions, it promotes those to help us self-correct or to find out more. In other words, somebody gives us an odd expression. We're curious. What does that expression mean? That feeling of curiosity is there to promote us, to get the CEO to say, hey, let's talk with this person and find out what that means. Or if we receive a frown, how are we going to interact? What are we going to do in order to turn that into something positive? And our brain promotes emotions in order to help us survive. So be able to identify which emotions go with which parts of the brain, and therefore which behaviors, which thoughts are going to really effectively fulfill the needs of that emotion. And then we know certain regions of the brain are associated with type. So what does that mean when it comes to type? Are there emotional response patterns? And the answer is yes. That just as I talked about leadership styles, that there are emotional styles, and those correspond actually very well with the leadership styles too, by the way. There are those emotional styles. In terms of what you come out of this, of course, I talk about these things over 1, 2, 3 days, and we do all these activities. What can you go away with to use with clients? And there's a variety of handouts, 1 pages, 2 pages, 4 pages, posters, whatever they are. Some of them they have similar introductions, and then they have different content inside, depending upon your need. So on the left here, we see this yellow one, and it's about performance, and it really is for cognitive skills. It's the kind of things you would give out. That's a 4-page handout on assessing and improving performance. So many times, companies, individuals say, I want to increase my skill in such and such area. How do I do that? Or we want to model some excellence of a couple of people, find out what's really working for them, make sure that stays working. What is that? So that's what that's designed for. And it starts with an introduction to the brain, and it's compatible with type. It has what I call the decoder spots, places that indicate type codes so that you can point the person's attention to, hey, you've identified with this type, therefore this is the meaning. That probably is bring your attention over here for a minute. Let's look at this because this is probably relevant to you. On the right side here, we see in red this emotion basics. It has a similar cover at the top. It shows the same brain map. It's a little bit different as we read on, and we get inside totally different. So this is more about emotion. And so for folks, when you would normally do EQ or something like that, you can keep doing EQ. You can bring in type, and then the basics actually brings together emotion and type in a really nice way. And we also have some one-page handouts, so assisting people in decision-making, assisting them in information gathering, so it's essentially that's judging and perceiving, and how do we again, work with type, but in a way that brings in the brain and gives people confidence that this is brain-based. So you get access to free access to this growing library of resources when you get certification. Which brings us to that all-important point: how do you earn certification? And with it, what is the full thing of what you get? So to earn certification, you attend all 3 days. Now, it may be you're on here and you've actually already attended day one, because I've done this for a lot of the regional APTi chapters. So if you are part of the Portland chapter, Seattle, San Diego, Sacramento, the Bay Area, Chicago, Dallas, a number of other spots, you will have already done day one, although quite a number of folks actually re-attend day one because they're like, there's so much good stuff, and because it's neuroscience, there's always some advancements, some new information. So you attend the workshop, and you attend those extra 2 days on Sunday and Monday. And by the way, if you're unable to attend over the course of going to Miami, the certification is offered at other times in other places. The next one up will be in North Carolina. So if you know Roger Pierman, at his center there, we'll actually be presenting it at Rogers Center. So although Miami this is a great opportunity because it works right in with the conference, this is not the one and only. They go on multiple times a year in different countries even. Pass the exam. So that's where people get a little, oh no, there's an exam. Yes, there's a 10-page exam. Because I want to be confident that when you go out in the world that you're confident that what you're saying fits with the neuroscience, not just from memory, sort of a passing memory, but it's there. And so that can be, we want that competence. Now, do know though, first of all, you don't take the exam during the certification. You have 1 year to take the exam. And you get a sample exam with answers, and you get a study guide that is extremely thorough. I taught at UCLA for 13 years. I'm still a fellow there, but in terms of teaching, I'm not teaching this year. I won Teacher of the Year award at UCLA. So I know how to create a study guide and sample exams and make sure you pass. Everybody who's taken it, I think we have almost 50 people now who've earned certification. They pass the exam. Some of them by, as they say, the skin of their teeth, but they passed. Make sure that happens. And then you submit also a 3-page report or equivalent project. And quite a number of people actually do the equivalent project. In other words, they learn about the material and they say, hey, I have a particular need. I want to make flashcards. And it's going to be neuroscience-based with some type stuff. And I'm like, absolutely, let's do that. I work with them, and that counts as their 3-page report. Other people have done simply a self-reflective piece. This is what the information has meant for me as somebody who loves type or a type practitioner, and they want to submit those 3 pages, and it's about themselves. So there's really a wide range of things. I always say, just talk to me and we'll make it work, because I want it to be relevant to you to meet your needs. So that's what it takes to earn certification. And we have a question here, by the way, wanting to know that they want to attend the certification, but they can't do the pre-workshop session. If you are in the Bay Area chapter and you have already done, you've already seen me in the Bay Area for one or more of my things, I would say it's actually very easy to get you up to speed because you've already seen me. I'll send you some stuff for review. You go ahead and attend the 2-day that's on Sunday and Monday, and we can get you certified. It's not a problem. Not a problem at all, Christine. And we have another one It says, although this is specific to MBTI, have you looked at correlations, or have you done any stuff that's specific to other things like the Baron EQ? I have not looked specifically, to be honest, at emotional intelligence, because that is something I've just started to look at beginning about a year ago. And why is that? Another model which I can speak on, and it's not just MBTI, is the Enneagram. Because folks in the Enneagram community over a year ago came to me and said, actually a year and a half now, this is great, but we don't use MBTI, or some of us do, but what about Enneagram? And I actually did end up doing research, brain research with folks, and looking at Enneagram results, and have a wonderful 20-page some odd paper, a bulletin, a journal article for them. So if you use Enneagram, know that there's actually, that all the stuff I'm talking about here works with the Enneagram, and you get access to that paper and research as well. But the point of that is, looking at the Enneagram, why is it useful? Because the Enneagram acts as a container for discussion, safe discussions around emotions and defenses. That's how I see as one of its biggest benefits. And that really prompted me to then go back and look at all of the data I had, the journal notes, the brain recordings, everything, to look at emotions, to read more about emotions, and to bring in that emotion stuff. And so it was actually looking at the Enneagram that promoted me to say, hey, what's going on with emotions? And so now I'm just starting to bring in more stuff and to say, okay, where does that match up with EQ? And I have to be careful, because in the academic community, emotional intelligence is not, it's recognized, people know it, but they're not necessarily super hot for it, to use a colloquial term. So emotional dynamics and knowing what's going on in the brain is actually a great way that I can have discussions with colleagues in academia. They love this stuff. And it can also, it's beginning to see it's tying into EQ. And wonderful. Okay, we also have a UCLA alumnus here as well. So what is certification? What do you get? You get personal support from me. Folks can attest to this. I can't guarantee in 5 years I'm going to keep giving every single email personal support, but I remain this very strong for the first 1 year afterwards. Anytime you have questions, you need a little bit of, you say like you want this particular handout, but you want the labels to be different. Sometimes, for example, I put in type labels and folks are like, no, take out the labels, I'll introduce those myself. I'm there and I do that. Okay? I respond to those things to give you personal support. You also get 30 minutes of Skype or a phone conversation free as part of the certification. And then even though I say 30 minutes, I'm on the phone longer than that, and that's fine. I'm not I don't have like a little clock there. There's also an online Dropbox. So this is a folder in the cloud, and it has PDF materials, so these posters and handouts and so on. A lot of folks prefer I print them in color, and I just put them in the mail and send them, and I do that at cost. But if you want to do them yourself, especially if you are in a foreign country, or your clients, you're meeting them in a foreign country, and they're like, can we get those printed over there? The only challenge is the printer over somewhere else needs to scale to American sizes. Okay, so if I say it is 2 feet by 3 feet, and I have one poster that's that big, that's more like what A paper is that? So that's, I'll work with you on that to make sure that works. And we've done that. We've had no problem. I've printed in Australia and Brazil and whatnot. We make that happen. Free use of online NeuroPQ. So it's essentially the skills assessment, but it's done online, and you get an automatic PDF report. Or rather, if you're not signed up yet as certification, I get the report and can forward it to you. If you are certified, I add you to the system, and your clients go there, they select your name, and you get the PDF reports. And you also get a binder, and you get this color slide deck that we use for the 3 days, and you get a nice little logo, which you can display on your website or as part of your book cover or whatever it is. And folks are already using, Jane Kesey is already using her logo. So it's nice to know folks can see, yes, you've gotten Neuroscience of Personality certified. Schedule, day 1, day 2, day 3, in case you're wondering. I'm not going to go in detail on this, but I'm just going to let you know, since you have access to this slide deck, that I say here what it is that we're doing on day 1, and therefore on days 2 and 3, what are you going to get that's different? Because day 3 is, day 2 and 3 are a little bit shorter than what we normally get by a few hours. Some of the professional roundtable stuff and using the materials, certification Q&A, We'll decide at that point what it is that we're going to put aside for a online meeting that takes place later. And of course, I record all of the online meetings so you get access to those. I suspect one of the activities we do is we go around the room and we hear from folks how they plan to use this material or just some random ideas that they're thinking of, and give feedback on that. And I think that's really handled well as either one-on-one individual phone calls. That's a great way to do it, or together on a Skype, something like that. A GoToWebinar. All the other stuff, though, assessing cognitive skills, doing stuff with teamwork. We do a whole brain-based team problem-solving activity. The skill-building stuff, executive styles, emotional dynamics, all of that we cover in those days 2 and 3. Who am I? You can take a look at the slide. I was at UCLA for 13 years, taught in a variety of things from anthropology to computer science. I know I'm an INTJ, so we have lots of weird interests that in our minds go together. Other folks, they're like, how do those go together? They do. And I've also, this is my 20th year working with type, and my 19th year being type certified. We used to call it qualified. I've worked with Linda Behrens, who's very well known in the type community back from the late 70s, and lots of stuff out there. You probably have heard my name. And this is sort of a, I had the absurd naivete to believe 5 or 6 years ago that I had learned everything I needed to know about type. And yeah, there's a few nooks and crannies here, but I'm going to go on to something else. And then I started the neuroscience and discovered I was completely wrong, and pleasantly surprised to learn that in fact the brain reveals so much more richness, not just about type, but about every individual who comes in front of me is different in the lab in some way. And the more so looking at midlife folks, the complexity that comes at midlife, having more patterns available to their brain and more flexibility in deploying them, more sensitivity to what's contextually appropriate compared to an 18-year-old. What people say, why do this? Jane, who has her background in education and does a lot with coaching, that the workshop course design provided key insights and understanding, also practical ways to apply with clients. ENFJ Doris, who is also coming from Europe, expert in engaging facilitation, a certification program, broadened my understanding, deepened my appreciation for diversity, inspiring me to learn more about neuroscience. And I ever thought I would. And yes, there is actually laughter, even though we're talking about neuroscience. One of the important things to know about those extroverted sensing, extroverted intuiting folks, when they're using their favorite functions, there should be laughter in the room. And if there's not laughter and smiles, then we're not using those functions, not really. So that's, we absolutely, I as an award-winning teacher, I believe that that action and what touches the heart, that those are important as part of the learning process. And finally, Anne Holm, who comes with a very wide background in terms of assisting people who suffer brain damage and is a certified coach, that we can correlate the brain imaginings and the behavioral findings, that we can correlate those to type, and that's fantastic. And we do that in a way that is detailed, and it is not abusive or overgeneralizing of the neuroscience. Okay, it honors the neuroscience that's out there. I don't just say the brain has 4 quadrants or something like that. It's not. We go deeper than that, and that's wonderful. Okay, that's not that level, extra level of detail reveals all this beautiful space that we can go to really add to our understanding and use of type. At the same time, though, I'm not going to overwhelm folks with the intricacies of neuron interactions or something like that. That's not what this is about. This is not a science class, but they're science. So the details, the real details, July 10th, 14th, 15th, what are the costs? If cost is a concern to you, I do have a payment program for the certification, so that it's, for the PCW, the pre-conference workshop, you sign up online as you would in Miami for any PCW, and then you pay that extra $7.99 for the 2 days. And if you want to go for certification, and I find most people, once they come, they do. In fact, I find very common, this happened in Australia. We went to the Australian type conference. I had 8 people signed up for the 3 days. Folks came to the pre-conference, a whole bunch of them, like 35, and right there on the spot, after that day, 7 of them said, you know what, we want to do the certification as well. So that absolutely is fine. If you change your mind, you just are going to do the PCW, and you're like, oh no, after the day I decided I want to do the certification. I know that's going to happen. It happens. Okay, so that's cool. So come for that, and then once you actually do the certification, most people want to do it. That's a little bit extra. You leave with those awesome resources, and there's that nice little location, and I think you wouldn't be here today if you didn't know where that location on the internet was, but know that that's there. And I think that's it. Okay. I'll stay on for any extra minutes for, wow, that's the first time I've finished something in exactly the time allotted. Usually I go like 5 minutes over or 5 minutes under or something like that. But I will be here to answer questions for anyone who has those. Otherwise, I'll briefly turn this back over to Tony, and then I'll stay on. I guess that's what I'll do.
Thanks, Dario. Yeah, we are dead on the end of our program time today, and I think the easiest thing to do might be to just go ahead and shut it down. Everybody should have your email address if they want to address any questions to you. I know we did. We had a few extra ones in the meeting chat that we didn't quite get to. So if everybody should be able to see it right there on the screen, Dario's got the little red dot hovering over it.
That dot is brilliant. I love that. That's just, I've
nice?
Never seen it. I love it. Yes.
So that is how to get in touch with Dario if you have any questions about the content or about the certification or anything like that. If you're having any technical issues on the APTi website, feel free to get in touch with us. If you don't already have that contact information, shame on you. It's plastered all over the website. And with that, we'll go ahead and shut down the recording. And everyone who registered for today, as we mentioned at the beginning, we'll go ahead and it's going to take a moment for me to get the recording rendered. But either Thursday or Friday of this week, tomorrow or the day after, we'll go ahead and we'll get the recording and the PowerPoint sent out to everyone to enjoy. So with that, thank you, Dario, for presenting. Thank you, everyone, for joining today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Yes, have a wonderful day, everyone. Cheers.